So welcome everybody. My name is Kate Colvin. I'm the CEO of Homelessness Australia, and this is the consultation on LGBTIQ plus homelessness for the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. Before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge that we're joining from the many unceded lands of Aboriginal nations around the country. I'm joining from Wurundjeri country and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to flag of course, we've got the referendum coming up in only 10 days, and working in homelessness, I guess I see every day the impact that that government not listening properly to Aboriginal communities about the solutions that will really work has in terms of massive overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in homelessness. And I can really see how having a voice to Parliament would make a difference in terms of just better policy outcomes on the ground. So certainly Homelessness Australia is supporting a yes vote. I'm personally supporting a yes vote, and I encourage everyone to take this invitation to make Australia better. So please feel free to add which country you're joining from in the chat, and to introduce yourself to friends and colleagues in the Zoom. I'm going to kick off by explaining a little bit about what the National Housing and Homelessness Plan is, and then a little bit of background context about what we know about overrepresentation of LGBTIQ people in homelessness. So first off, what is the National Housing and Homelessness Plan? So prior to the last election, the Labor government, then in opposition, committed to developing a 10-year National Housing and Homelessness Plan. So we haven't had one in Australia really ever. In 2008, the Rudd government developed a National Homelessness Plan, but this is a National Housing and Homelessness Plan. So it's both housing and homelessness, and it stretches across both federal government policy and state government policy. So it really is a pretty big opportunity for government to be asking the big questions, such as how do we end homelessness and what needs to change in government policy to address that issue. And even though the government's, it would seem that their view is that they're just looking narrowly at what needs to change within homelessness policy specifically, in other countries that have done national plans to end homelessness, that policy view has looked really broadly and asked the really big questions about what do we need to change to really prevent homelessness happening. And so we are encouraging the federal government to be taking that kind of approach to the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. And part of the some of the things that at Homelessness Australia, which I forgot to mention, is the peak body for homelessness in Australia, is asking those questions about what needs to change in terms of big issues like poverty. Addressing poverty is a massive driver of homelessness, but also around discrimination, and discrimination against LGBTIQ plus people is obviously one of the reasons that drives the overrepresentation of the community among people who are homeless. So that's one of the issues we want to talk about today, but we also want to be talking about, well, if people do lose their homes, what's needed when you come to homeless services? What do good homelessness services look like? What does good housing look like for people in the LGBTIQ plus community? So I'm not going to talk a lot today, because this is basically a consultation to support Homelessness Australia to, include these issues in the right way in our submission to the national plan. But it's also an opportunity, and I would encourage everyone on the call to think about making a submission to the National Housing and Homelessness Plan, and to use the ideas and discussion that you hear today to inform your own submission. It's not complicated to write a submission. It could just be a page or just a few pages to really just think through and communicate to government, what do you think's needed to prevent homelessness? for LGBTIQ plus people and what is needed to better respond to homelessness if it does happen for the same community. So it can just be, it doesn't have to be in really formal language. If it can be just put it down what your answer to those questions would be and share that with government, because they really need to hear from people in the whole community. So I did just want to flag, there's some research that's been done that identifies some of the drivers of overrepresentation of LGBTIQ plus people in homelessness. One of the issues that's identified, and I think others are going to pick up on this through the presentations, is that when people come to homeless services, their sexual identity or gender identity is not properly recorded. So we don't have accurate numbers of everyone who comes through homelessness services and what their gender identity or sexuality is. So, but there is some data that does show that. Mm-hmm. And what we know is that there is an overrepresentation. We know that LGBTIQ plus people are around twice as likely to become homeless as other people in the community, and are also, when they do become homeless, more likely to also have other vulnerabilities, like, for example, mental health issues or substance use issues. And one of the what the research shows is that one of the reasons for that is that often family rejection and conflict violence within families is a driver of homelessness for LGBTIQ plus people, and that those experiences of family rejection and violence in the home are very traumatizing, and then the consequence is those mental health issues and substance use issues that I talked about. And so, of course, that then affects how homeless services need to be provided, because they, of course, need to be responding to the issue of not having a home, but also supporting people with those other experiences of trauma. Now, so I said what the data shows is that the overrepresentation is about twice as much. I think Michelle might talk about this, but the data that homeless services have, and particularly youth homeless services, shows that LGBTIQ plus young people are around 25 to 40% of all young people who are homeless. So that's an even greater overrepresentation than would be suggested by the data. So with those not very cheerful statistics, I'm going to hand over to James from, I'm just having a mental blank, from LGBTIQ plus Health Australia, which is the national peak organisation working to promote the health and wellbeing of LGBTIQ plus people and communities. And James has worked in policy, advocacy and strategy for over 30 years and is going to talk to us about health impacts of homelessness for LGBTIQ plus people. So over to you, James.
Thank you, Kate. I'm just going to share my screen, and of course I'm the first person to forget to press the share screen button, the unmute yourself button, and I'm sure I won't be the last one to do it today. Welcome everyone. I'd just like to do a quick acknowledgement of country as well as I get started, acknowledging the traditional custodians in Australia. I suspect that I'm going to repeat a number of things, and you're going to hear a few messages that Kate has given you across the board. And I think the most important messages sort of that we'll keep repeating are the lack of data, the overrepresentation, the importance of having visibility and the diversity. But I think I also want to answer another couple of questions, and the real one might be, why is LGBTIQ plus Health Australia interested in this topic and participating today? We're the Health Peak organisation, and we believe that people's genders, bodies, relationships and sexualities affect every part of their lives, including housing and homelessness. And when I look across what data we do have, the themes that underpin health and the themes that underpin homelessness constantly intersect with each other. So, a bit of background, our challenges. There's limited research, but we do know across the board there's a higher proportion of LGBTIQ plus people experiencing homelessness than the general population. We're not counted in the census, but there are signs of hope for the next census. And most importantly, there's an ongoing adoption of a standard for counting sex, gender, variations of sex characteristics, and sexual orientation, which is slowly being implemented across the board in Australia, with data starting to appear. And we hope that it will be adopted either in its current form or in an improved form in the next census to give us information. The last ABS General Social Survey asked some questions about sexuality, not the full range of questions about gender and intersex status, but what it highlighted was 33.7% of lesbian and gay and 25.8% of bisexual people reported having been homeless, compared with 13.4% of the heterosexual population. So that gives us a guide. What I wanted to do with you today was to do a little bit of a deeper dive into one of the pieces of information that we do have, which are the large-scale surveys, private lives and writing themselves in, which are large-scale surveys of LGBTIQ plus people. However, I do want to highlight that it lacks data about people with intersex variation. The numbers, despite best attempts, of people with innate variations of sexual characteristics were not high enough to give any useful data. And so I'm deeply in debt for most of what I'm about to say to the Australian Research Centre for Sex, Health and Society, which does these surveys at the La Trobe University. So what do they ask? They ask people about homelessness, and just in passing, so you can have a quick read, I'm not going to read through it. This is the definition of homelessness that they ask people in their survey about. And here's what they found looking across our LGBTQ, noticing I've dropped the I out because the data doesn't tell us much about it. It stands out that trans women, trans men, and non-binary people across the board are much more likely to experience homelessness at some stage in their lives. Looking at sexual orientation, pansexual and queer, or other. Now, I don't know the underlying reasons for that, but it's certainly something that we need to be aware of in services. But I'm going to give you the best guess of what the data points to, and that's that those people who experience greatest stigma and discrimination are also likely to be those people who are more likely to experience homelessness. Here's what I'm most wanting to tell you about in this data. And sorry, as I go through, I should have mentioned Private Lives is a survey of adults over 18. So we're here looking at the adult data at the moment, and I'll swing back and have a look at the younger people's data in a moment. But when people are asked about the circumstances relating to their experience of homelessness, here's what they answer. My apologies if this is a bit small, but looking down the list, the greatest response is financial stress issues. Not surprising, but looking down the list, mental health issues, unemployment, another form of financial stress, rejection from family, family violence, violence and harassment, substance use, discrimination, disability, rejection from peers, chronic illness. Other than the explicit financial stress and unemployment and underemployment, we're talking health and well-being issues across the board are what over 18s see themselves as experiencing when they find themselves in homelessness. The intractable, interlinked issues between tackling the health of LGBTIQ plus people and homelessness. Let me now have a quick look at the younger cohort. So writing themselves in for, again, this is their definition of what they're asking younger people aged between 14 and 21, whether they'd experienced homelessness. It's really the same issue. It's provided in simpler language to help people respond. Here's what the data shows us. Again, the green bars are any homelessness in the past 12 months. The blue-purple bars are homelessness ever. Again, trans men, trans women, non-binary, far more likely to experience homelessness. And in the data for younger people, there's less variation, but again, that's pansexual, queer, and other are coming right up high on the data. And when those people were asked what were the perceived causes of their homelessness, again, mental health issues, rejection from family, family violence, financial stress. You can see when we're looking at younger people, again, health, discrimination, well-being are the top level issues, and financial stress gets pushed down. Going down the list further, violence, harassment in previous accommodation, discrimination, rejection from peers, substance use, unemployment and underemployment, disability, chronic illness. The list, while different, broadly raises exactly the same themes. So what are some of the key takeaways? LGBTIQ people have about twice the rates of homelessness compared to the general population, particularly trans and gender diverse people. 20 to 25% report experiences of homelessness directly related to being LGBTIQ plus. And so writing themselves in young people, that was the younger people, that was 23.6%. And for the older over 18s, 22%. And I just want to mention in passing a wonderful study by the Housing Aged Action Group, Out of the Closet, which looks specifically at older people. So this is across the age range. 16% of the older people in that study were currently experiencing or at risk of homelessness, and 40% reported previously being at risk of homelessness across the full range of ages. So when we look at health disparities and why LGBTIQ plus people are more likely to experience ill health and mental health, it's directly related to stigma, prejudice, discrimination, and abuse. That many people have multiple layers of oppression, discrimination, and stigma. So those people with disabilities, those people who are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, from cultural and linguistically diverse backgrounds, there are greater risks and barriers that impact on homelessness, stigma, and health. And they more often than not face significant barriers to accessing health and other services both fear of discrimination, actual discrimination, or services that are not designed for them. It's vital the homelessness and housing sector across Australia is equipped to provide culturally safe services. And I just want to mention, while there is not much research or information about homeless LGBTI people and ill health, we know that the evidence overwhelmingly shows that homeless people experience worse health than the general population. And we know from what's available that carries across. So homelessness can cause further health problems, exacerbating existing conditions, particularly depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. It can increase vulnerability to some conditions, trauma, injury, skin conditions, wounds, respiratory conditions, depression and anxiety. And when you look at people who are homeless, it's likely to involve serious mental illness, problematic alcohol and other drugs, early onset aging, brain injury. Homeless people often die younger, often due to treatable conditions. And so finally, I just want to point you to this and happy to share this information. You can look at Private Lives 3 and writing themselves in for yourself, and the links are there, or the Out of the Closet, Out of Options report from HAG. But I'd also like to, and I'm not going to go into it in detail because our other speakers will focus more on it and are better than us. LGBTIQ plus Health Australia worked to assist in the development of an inclusive practice guide for homelessness and housing sectors, which is on our website if you'd like to have a look at it. And I'll finish on that note, Kate, and pass back to you.
Thanks, James. And I'll now introduce Joe Ball. So Joe is the CEO of Switchboard Victoria, and which runs Australia's only LGBTIQ plus dedicated family violence prevention helpline, the Rainbow Door, and is also a long-standing activist in the LGBTIQ plus community. So over to you, Joe.
Okay, I'm glad you kept that bio. Well, I almost interrupted you. I always find bios the weirdest thing, really. Look, today I am on the lands of the Yalukit Willen clan of the Bunurong people, and Switchboard is based on those lands too. The elders of this land that I am on have asked us to say yes on October the 14th. And because of their ask, and because we at Switchboard believe the voice is a very important first step, Switchboard is supporting and campaigning for a yes vote. And of course, like today, we're talking about homelessness, and we need to remember that it's invasion and the ongoing colonization of these lands that has forced First Nations people to become and stay homeless on their own lands, which means that fighting homelessness for all of us is a decolonization project. As Kate said, I am Joe Ball. I'm the CEO of Switchboard Victoria. I use the pronouns he, him. I'm a proud transgender man. Now, today, you are all the experts in the room. I can see from so many of your names and recognizing them, you are the homelessness experts, or, you know, the frontline workers. Those two things go together, experts and frontline workers. And I'm just going to today offer some observations, I guess, and then I just have one ask of you all, really, from me and from Switchboard. So when I came out to my parents in the late 90s, I lost a safe home to live in. I kept myself safe by crashing out on friends' couches, and I slept in my car. This went on for 6 months. During this time, I tried to get onto Centrelink. I think it was actually called Department of Social Services then. And I was told by Centrelink that your parents not accepting your sexuality was not a reason to not be able to live in their home, regardless of the circumstances of what that living might look like. Now, I never thought of myself over those 6 months as someone who was experiencing homelessness. I thought of myself as someone who was coming out. I thought of myself as an LGBTIQA plus people, and I thought that's what it meant to be someone in our community, is that this is just par for the course. And this was, of course, confirmed by so many friends around me who had had similar experiences of crashing out in couches, living in cars, being in community in this way, in complicated community. And so it confirmed to me that this is what it meant to be LGBTIQA plus. I mean, my journey into housing and my fights with Centrelink is a story for another day. However, my experience then, it was far from unique then. And tragically, when I told this story at the National Youth Homelessness Conference this year, it was confirmed from all the young people and service providers who came up to me after I'd spoken. They said that it is not unique today, your story, and that too many, particularly today, trans and gender diverse young people have exactly the same story. Now, today, I don't work specifically in homelessness, but I do run a service through our helpline Rainbow Door that refers people experiencing homelessness into homeless services. I want a world where being LGBTIQA+, including taking actions around affirming your gender or sexuality or coming out, doesn't mean that you're at a higher risk of homelessness. But on the journey to that world, that better day, we need to respond now to those who need us right now. And of course, it is across all ages. My story is a one of homelessness as a young person. But what we know from the Housing Action Group report is that it is of all ages and LGBTIQA+ people, and there is a major issue in older LGBTIQA+ people experiencing homelessness due to entrenched poverty within that community. Now, the National Homelessness Plan offers us all here today a very important opportunity that I believe in, and I strongly believe, however, that if we are not specifically and meaningfully identified throughout the strategy as a priority cohort in need of a targeted response, I think the plan will fail our communities. So some of my overarching thoughts on what needs to be in the plan, to not tie us up in too much conversation, not to take up too much time, is that we need to ensure that all housing and homelessness services are LGBTIQA+ inclusive. That specific LGBTIQA+ programs and housing shelters are needed for the most vulnerable in the community who cannot access mainstream services due to past trauma or fears of discriminatory treatment from staff and or residents. That peer support has a crucial role and has been shown already to be effective in supporting LGBTIQA+ people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness, and those who are LGBTIQA+ and have experienced homelessness. A focus on primary prevention must identify those who are most likely to be or be at risk of homelessness, and we need to call out older people within that, because there's always a focus in LGBTIQA+ service provision across all of our cohorts on youth, and youth are very important. But we know that there can be this invisibility in the older cohorts, and that is certainly the case within housing stability and homelessness. So we need to include all parts of our community. Prevention, we need to be thinking about prevention, and that can include education in schools, families. We need people to not have experiences like me and the many young people who I met at the National Youth Homelessness Conference who were LGBTIQA+. We need to prevent homelessness before it starts. And so looking at the drivers of why people don't feel like their homes are not safe. And we need to educate medical professionals, hospitals, as well as those working in the homeless and support services. And before I finish today, as I said, I would leave it brief. I want to ask you all to consider one specific thing in your submissions if you are going to make a submission. Now, this is quite specific. And if people know me or follow me, you'll know that I've got a real thing for the census and making it inclusive. And I have a real passion on this particular topic, and that is that in the 2026 census, I'm very hopeful that LGBTIQA+ people will be counted. And I've achieved a lifetime goal of being on the expert advisory group to the ABS 2026 census. And there is a commitment from both the ABS and the current ALP government, both an election commitment and a current government commitment to deliver on counting LGBTI people in the census. However, unless sex, gender, sexuality, and intersex questions are asked on the homeless census short form, LGBTIQA+ people living in crisis accommodation, boarding houses, temporary housing, and who are rough sleepers will not be recorded. Now, people, when they campaign for the short form, when they campaign for changes to the census, they forget that there are many forms and there are many ways that data is collected in the census, full stop. And for homeless communities, people are counted in administrative data and they're counted in the homeless short form. So please consider putting that on into your submissions. And if we can get that alongside us otherwise being counted, I think that will be a huge win. Counting rough sleepers, counting people who are experiencing homelessness is hard and difficult, and we'll be faced with lots of questions about that this is just too hard. But with our overrepresentation in our community, we do need to be counted. Finally, I'll end there. I want to thank Kate and Homelessness Australia for organising this event today. And I want to thank all of you who provide services to our community every single day, especially to frontline workers, and the care and concern you give to LGBTIQA+ people. I'll be here throughout the session, but I'm really here to listen to all your contributions, and thank you for coming.
Thanks so much, Joe. And can I pass over to Michelle now? Michelle Thompson's the acting CEO at Family Access Network, which is a fantastic homelessness service provider in Melbourne's East, and a leading provider of homelessness services to LGBTIQ+ young people. So over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Kate. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, and for us here at FAN, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. Also want to acknowledge that land was never ceded, and that the vast overrepresentation of Aboriginal people amongst those experiencing homelessness is a direct and ongoing consequence of colonisation. FAN is also supporting the yes vote up in the upcoming referendum, and for some of us, this is the second time that we've had to endure a yes vote campaign. So also want to acknowledge that things are feeling a bit tough for some people right now. So I want to talk about FAN. We've been doing this since 2006, working with young LGBTIQ people with a homelessness response. Our program is statewide for Victoria, so referrals can come from across the state. We did manage to get that through with DFFH, that you don't have to present at an opening door. You can come directly to FAN because of our client cohort being so vulnerable that we didn't want them to have to jump any more hoops than they had to. So from the outset, when we started this in 2006, what we did was adopt an all-of-organisation approach, and this is reflected in all of our auditing systems, so our language, our referrals, our client casework documents, everything is all supported by all the staff, board, volunteers, and everyone has to undergo LGBTIQ inclusive practice training, and we do that as a minimum yearly. So our program is called All Sorts. So this was the first model for the provision of housing and support tailored to the LGBTIQ+ young people experiencing or at risk of homelessness in Victoria. So this happened predating the Rainbow Tick by several years, and it was designed as a demonstration model for which, a broader service system response, could be created and shaped. So since 2006, we launched All Sorts. It's grown and evolved, and is with a focus on best practice support and a whole of organisation approach, and of course, continuous quality improvement. It's now one of many LGBTIQ+ inclusive practice models, and the effectiveness of it as an approach is evidenced in our accreditation as a Rainbow Tick organisation in 2014. We were the first homelessness service in Victoria to receive the accreditation. But what this also needed was cultural change, and that only occurs if you've got a whole of organisation approach. Needs to be adopted and guided through leadership and supported by management and governance to make sure all your programs Services, facilities, operational systems are all LGBTIQ plus inclusive. And we at FAN regularly undertake a full audit of all aspects of the organisation. So that's making sure our data, our policies, our intake, our assessment, all of that stuff is LGBTIQ inclusive. So being inclusive is the responsibility of every worker in our organisation, not just one person or one team. It's important that effecting cultural change, providing cultural safety to LGBTIQ clients and workers, and for ensuring the sustainability of the work being done. It's also vital that this work is both championed and role modelled by the organisation's leadership team in a hierarchical organisation model, and particularly in a sector where frontline workers are endeavouring to solve crisis situations in a time and resource poor environment. Being inclusive may be dismissed as one more thing, we know, in some organisations, and being a low priority, but it's really important that that's undertaken. So building inclusivity needs to be set as a priority by an organisation's governance and management, and staff need to be supported in learning and undertaking these inclusive practices. So, of course, being inclusive is a process, it's not a destination. And at FAN, the process of continuously improving organisational inclusivity is administered by, we have a staff LGBTIQ portfolio, so we have a lens over that. They meet every 6 to 8 weeks to make sure they monitor and review all of our LGBTIQ plus inclusivity in our organisation. And a key outcome of this continuous quality improvement process has been FAN's successful accreditation as the Rainbow Tick organisation. We're about to do it for a 4th time next month. And having this portfolio assists with the sharing of the responsibility of inclusive practice here, and ensuring that knowledge and momentum aren't lost during when there's like staff turnover. As we know, you might have one person who looks after an organisation, but once they're gone, then all that is gone with them. So, staff turnover, is recognised as a key barrier in maintaining, organisational culture and knowledge to assist with maintaining an inclusive organisational culture. Okay. At FAN, we recognise that LGBTIQ plus young people often face discrimination and rejection from their families of origin, from their peers and service providers. So to redress this inequity for LGBTIQ young people in accessing safe housing, FAN is proud we have to offer 3 transitional housing properties exclusively for the use of LGBTIQ young people. 2 of the properties accommodates 3 young people, in addition with a lead tenant, while the second accommodates 2 young people. So the lead tenant properties we have are for the younger cohort who might need to have a role model and need support in the house, whereas the 2-bedroom property we have is designated to young people who need less support and already might have some independent skills. Of course, there's pros and cons to offering an LGBTIQ specific accommodation versus offering accommodation that's open to people from all communities, but inclusive of LGBTIQ plus people. In FAN's experience, the provision of shared accommodation exclusive to LGBTIQ plus people results in the best outcomes for our particular clients. LGBTIQ plus young people aged 15 to 25 is who we service. And they're often escaping family violence or have experienced high rates of peer rejection and have little or no experience in independent living. So as shared housing is the most common and affordable form of private rental available to young people when exiting the specialist homelessness service. So we developed a shared living skills. So it's really critical, to the success of the young people being able to move into private rental. It's important also to note that just because a service has LGBTIQ plus specific accommodation, it should not mean LGBTIQ plus clients are expected or required to use it. Rather, a client-centred approach is always recommended, and a number of FAN clients from the LGBTIQ plus community have not wished to take up our LGBTIQ specific responses and have been successfully accommodated in general shared housing as well. So we think it's important to have those options. Along with setting up the housing, we also set up a social support group, our Eastern Diversity Group, recognising that social disconnectedness of LGBTIQ plus young people And it's predominantly funded by, local government and philanthropic grants, and we're always having to fundraise to keep the group going, but it's been running continuously since 2006. We've also developed a best approach with working with young LGBTIQ homelessness people. We first did that in 2006 and we recently updated that in 2020. It's available on our website if anybody wants that. We're also very pleased, though, in 2022, so some 16 years later, a new initiative was funded by the state government to pilot LGBTIQ plus homelessness response in Victoria for all ages. And we were fortunate enough to be a partner agency in the successful consortia. So that's in partnership with Vincent Care, Drummond Street and Uniting. And we've implemented a response to cover metro and regional areas of Victoria. It's called Pride in Place. You can also look them up on the website, and it provides a comprehensive, safe and inclusive recovery pathways for LGBTIQ people who are experiencing homelessness. So again, that's, while FAN is youth specific, this program is open to all ages. I could go on and on what I think needs to be fixed in the system, and I'm happy to add more to it as we go, but yeah, I'm quite interested to hear what others have got to add.
So much, Michelle. And so, look, the rest of the conversation is for all of us to contribute and ask questions. So I'll kick off just by asking if anyone's got a question of any of the panelists, or if you think, in terms of thinking through what needs to be in the National Housing and Homelessness Plan to end homelessness for LGBTIQ plus people, if you think there's something that we haven't mentioned yet that needs to be in there, now's the time to speak up. And you can use the, if you scroll down to, like, if you look at the bottom of the screen where it says reactions, there's a hand up thing there, and then I can see who wants to speak. So I think first of all, I've got Ruby. Do you want to jump in?
Thank you so much, Kate. And thanks to all the speakers for sharing. It was really appreciated. I wanted to ask Michelle. Sorry, really quickly. I'm Ruby. I'm here on Wandryland, and I'm the SOGI advisor for the Human Rights Commission. And I wanted to ask around particular intersections that you see a lot of in the youth LGBTIQ plus housing space. I know that we've like I mentioned a few, but I know that it's become a particular high area in disability, and I was wondering if that's something that's showing in the cohorts that you're working with, Michelle.
Yeah, definitely. Trans and gender diverse would be our main cohort. Many of them do come who do have a disability, and I would say the majority of our young people are neurodiverse. So there's lots of things we need to think about when working with that cohort. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And over to Cara.
Good afternoon. Cara Brackstone, pronouns she and her, and I'm on Yorta country at the moment. I work with the Salvation Army, and we provide specialist homelessness services. This question is, I suppose, for James or perhaps Joe with his advocacy to the ABS. To what extent will these hopeful changes with the census or the ABF data set influence the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare? Because most of our ongoing data relating to client services is fed up to AIHW and can contribute to invisibility of LGBTIQ plus statistics and people's experiences.
If I can, Kate, Cara, not to really bounce it back to you, but I think you can help us as much as anything. LHA has been doing a lot of advocacy to get the ABS 2020 standard implemented across all relevant data sets in Australia. So I'm not sure if you're aware of the standard, but sort of back in 2020, I think in some ways almost a consolation prize for the failure to include relevant questions in the census. A standard was completed to give common questions and common variables to allow data to be comparable across different data sets. Now, the ABS and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare are progressively rolling that out across their work, and we continue to talk to government in a whole range of areas. So, for example, coroner's data and recording information there, so we know cause of death and whether it's related. In Tasmania, there's a whole of government process going on to get the standard implemented across the Tasmanian government. And while I think the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare is certainly sympathetic, supportive, and heading in that direction, to have people who are providing data to them and using their data asking, have you implemented the standard? Are you implementing the standard? And how can we help you implement the standard, is one of the most important steps forward to make a real difference. And in some ways, while the census is incredibly important, because it'll answer one of those fundamental questions we don't know the answer to. How many LGBTIQ plus people are there in Australia? And if you can't answer that question, every time the ABS does a survey, it doesn't have a full data set to do the comparison with. And so you have to start making an enormous number of guesses to say, is 20% of this survey reflected across 100% of Australia? So getting the standard into every piece of work they do is incredibly important.
Thank you, James. Good insight.
Can I just add to that, I know some agencies have commissioned additional capacity in the SHIP data set to be able to record these questions, but it's not universally available because it's kind of agency by agency. So the SHIP data set, which for people who are not in the homelessness service system, when people come into a homelessness service, all homeless services use the same data recording tool to record demographic data about the person, what they're seeking in terms of homelessness services, what they receive, and that all feeds up to a data set which is published by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. So it's sort of in that data set that we need to be asking the questions and recording that information. So it's possible to do, but it's not yet universally available.
No, I just would add to that. I think that's right. There's two challenges with data collection. I mean, the other thing about the census is its full title, which people don't know its full title, is it's a population and housing survey. And if you remember, it's asking you how it's important to count the population, but it's really important to count the housing that is in Australia. And that's why you answer all the questions about dwelling, and it tells us a lot about overcrowding, or it can, if it's so it can actually show a lot about our communities, about whether which we know a lot of people live in share houses throughout their lives, like how we live in housing, and how we're dealing with insecure housing, and also our incomes, and is very much important questions. But also the thing that James said is baseline testing. It's the unsexy part of the census that people don't get super excited about. But if you don't have a baseline number, it is just guessing. And every academic survey is just guessing at the moment, because we're just proposing what the baseline is in Australia. So there's a technology question around which Kate talked about with SHIP data, but I think the other question is the willingness or the authorizing environment of workers to have these conversations. And I can't, like the amount of people, I do a lot of work with women's health organizations in the family violence space, have these conversations with people, and people believe that asking the questions, as did Michael Sukkar when he stopped the questions from being asked in the last census, a lot of workers feel that asking the question itself is offensive or will drive people away from services. So they feel like to ask the question, what is your how would you like to be referred to, what's your pronoun, what's your sexuality, people feel like that will limit people's access to service. But actually a lot of affirmative practice and evidence base actually shows that the inverse is true, that LGBTIQA plus people, when they're offered those questions, they feel like this is a safe place to come. But I think that's a big challenge we've got to think about. And when I'm saying that all services need to be LGBTI inclusive, and Michelle spoke to these points, it's certainly not about having a rainbow flag painted on the front door. It's about the very first experience you have when you walk in that door. And one of those experiences is data, that conversation when you're going through the risk assessment questions, when you're having a conversation, when you're just being asked, what is your name? They are big moments. For the first time, that could be the first time the person is going to be able to tell you, well, my name is this, but I'd love it if you'd call me blah, blah, blah. And that can be such an incredible experience.
Thanks, Joe. Buzz, did you want to ask a question or make a comment? Oh, Buzz, you're just on mute.
Hi, I just wanted to make a comment. I've noticed that on the National Housing Plan webinar that I was attending the other day, that there didn't seem to be an actual specific intention to include LGBTI community on the document. Like in reading the document and what they presented, there was no reference to our community at all. I raised it on the chat sort of thing, and the convener of the webinar sort of brought it up as an issue that they'd look into. But I just kind of thought there's obviously a service gap there that they're, not, acknowledging us as a targeted minority group. And we should be, because, back in the 80s, mid-80s, when I was doing activism and stuff with government departments and in Victoria, we were a targeted minority group that, because we were particularly vulnerable. So along with young Indigenous, disabled and young women. So, and I just don't see why in the development of government and stuff, that's sort of gone out the window. Why has that happened? So what do people think, and how do we fix that so that we're included and we're not invisible and we're not erased as far as the housing issue goes?
Can I just reply first, and then I'll pass it over to others who might want to comment on this point. I think you make a really good point, and part of the reason that we wanted to have this session is to create more visibility for this issue, and government have also been invited to participate. I'm not sure, I can't see in the list whether or not anyone's joined, but we will publish the recording of this discussion, and then also include it as a priority certainly in the Homelessness Australia submission. But part of the way I think we can change that is, like, you've already gone along to one of the community consultations and raised it, but also by more people making a contribution to the process to say this is a really important issue that needs to be explored properly within the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. That makes a difference. And one of the challenges that we face with the National Housing and Homelessness Plan is that a lot of the focus is in the housing part of it, and housing is a really important part of the picture. But when a major driver into homelessness is family violence, family rejection, discrimination in the community, obviously those are not issues that housing alone can solve. And so we need the plan to be sort of looking at these broader policy issues, which I feel like we're still in the process of encouraging government to look at that broader scope. Does anyone else want to jump in on that point?
If I could, Buzz, across the board in almost every government consultation I'm involved with, LGBTIQ plus people are not brought up unless I or one of the other people in our community brings it up. And more often than not, that opens up a flood of sympathetic and supportive noises. And at a national level, LGBTIQ plus people are included in a wide range of significant health strategies and plans, often without the specific actions and the specific funding needed to be delivered. So the fact that we are all here and the fact that we are considering putting in submissions is absolutely critical to make sure that we are visible in the plan and that the broad diversity of who we are is understood and there. So it's not just LGBTIQ plus people as some homogenous blob, but that we understand that intersex people are not in the data and we really don't know what's going on there. Trans and gender diverse people stand out as being in greater need, but there are specific issues and specific needs across the board. And we need to sadly keep telling that story and making it visible and getting it on the agenda.
Thanks, James. Oliver, over to you.
Thanks so much, Kate and James. My name's Oliver Fahey from the Toowoomba, Tasmania, Palor country. I'm on the Launceston City Council's Homelessness Advisory Committee, and I brought up this issue of lack of data and quoted the same sources recently. I was interested in, sorry, I think it was Cara who was talking about the auditing of top to bottom LGBT, what's the word? But what I'm trying to ask is, how do you get an organisation to audit itself like that, or have an independent organisation to audit city councils in that way?
I guess what we did was the first time before we did the rainbow tick was we did a self-audit to know that we were ready to go before we went through that accreditation. So I suggest to a lot of people, if you don't want to go through the rainbow tick process, that's fine, but do a self-audit. I know there's other sorts of tools that you can use as well. But yeah, we also had client consultation just to make sure all of our forms and everything were right. We implemented the training, as I said, from the board down to volunteers. We have to take a whole of organisation approach. And, things constant language changes. So we're constantly reviewing our assessment forms and everything all the time. But it's really important to get, everyone on board. But yeah, first thing I can suggest is using some sort of tool like the rainbow tick and doing a self-audit and see where you're at.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Oliver. I can't see any other hands up, so I'm going to ask a sort of fresh question and sort of bring us back into that prevention space. And I think one of the questions which is really I don't have sort of an exact answer to, so I'm throwing it out to all of you, is this issue of discrimination and family rejection and that lead people into homelessness or push people into homelessness, and what do you think would be the most effective interventions to have a lot less people coming out of family situations like that into homelessness? So how do we better support those families to be inclusive, is my question. And I'll put that out to everyone to see what, if there's any. Everyone's got the magic bullet. Oliver, do you want to?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I'd just say that reflecting on when I was in high school, which was nearly a bit over 10 years ago now, it would have been really helpful we only had a school chaplain, and that was not a space that I was feeling comfortable in. So having like a school therapist is really important, who could have a parent come along to a meeting and to kind of mediate those first kind of sessions, I think would be a really helpful start.
So just to clarify, you're suggesting if you have a worker within the school that a young person could flag, look, I need some help, and that worker therapist could invite the parents and have a mediated conversation with the young person and the parents about, yeah, that's a really great idea. Kay, over to you.
Thanks, Kate. Good morning, everybody. I'm Kay Bradshaw. I work with Uniting Big Tas. We are the recipients of a Hay Partnership grant, which funds a couple of workers in Shepparton. And we also deliver a lot of services in the youth area. And what we know is that there is an overwhelming demand from parents, both through the youth focused services and through Orange Door and through our child protection related services. There's an overwhelming demand from parents to get better educated about, working with and supporting their transgender diverse, neurodiverse, and sometimes with other disabilities as well, to understand, where they're at and how they can actually do better as parents. What we don't see is very much available to support those parents. In fact, I recently picked up a flyer for a program which is being advertised by a private clinic where parents were being invited to contribute nearly $600 for a 6-week program. It's just out of reach for many of the parents that we interact with. And I think that, that fundamental level of education that you raised, Jo, in schools and for families is really critical to intervening and helping parents to avoid those kind of really deep conflicts which lead to young people leaving.
Thanks, Kay. Yeah, that's another really good point. And Jo, over to you.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like when I explained a little bit about my story, but when I used to think for a long time about, chosen family, which is a term we use in LGBTIQ plus communities, and it's really important. But one of the things I've learned, probably quite glaringly at Switchboard, where we have a dedicated national suicide prevention program, is behind so much of the suicides in our community, and I won't go into this a great deal, but is family rejection. And we know around so much homelessness is family rejection. And I think we have to, and I me and the manager in the suicide prevention program, we often say, in order to stop LGBTI suicides, we've got to change the world. And I say optimistically, but also what I mean is the world around the people. In order that, it's not about small, like we all need to do our own part, but we actually need to change the cultural fabric here, where a parent thinks that because of the different influences in their life, some of them might be faith or cultural or political parties, that is, that they would choose, that they would feel that they couldn't just love their child for the way that they are. And that they would say such hurtful and horrible things to their child because of and that would drive some of the really devastating things that we see around homelessness and suicide. And I think that means that when I go back to the chosen family thing, is that I used to think the chosen family would be enough. But what I find behind so many of these stories is that people need to reconcile with their families of origin in one way or another. Sometimes if it's abusive, it's to reconcile in order to have good boundaries. But in other ways, a lot of people need to reconcile with those core things in their life, and family is really core. And so we need to do a lot of work in the parent space. I'm a huge advocate in this, and we cannot ignore it. And we need to have parent services. We need to have like Transcend is a national, trans and gender diverse parent support service. At Switchboard, we have some family programs that we do around rainbow families. But we need a lot more investment, a lot more focus in parenting, and We need to be really cheering on when the cultural institutions that influence parents are doing the right thing as much as when they're doing the wrong thing. So when there are faith-based from all different faiths, when they are being affirming, that we need to cheer them on, whatever that faith is, a Jewish, Islamic, Christian, we need to cheer on those. And when sporting organizations, you know, like that's a huge part of people's, you know, influence, when sporting organizations are doing the right thing, when they're doing the Pride Cup, when they're doing those things, we need to cheer them on and get involved and encourage people as much as we need to comment when there's the terrible actions. So that's what I would say, is we need to be part of changing the culture of this climate we're in. And for trans and gender diverse people, you know, I think we need to recognize that there's a lot of disinformation that parents are exposed to that is extremely harmful, that's incorrect about the medical treatment, or sometimes it's not even about medical treatment, it's about the psychological supports of trans and gender diverse kids. So we need to combat the disinformation, and we need to have be dealing in reality and facts. And yeah, that's some of my thoughts, but I'm a very strong supporter around youth homelessness in our space, that we need to be thinking about parents and investing in it.
Thanks, Joe. And I think Oliver, and then Michelle, and then James.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to touch on something you said, Joe, about, you know, how chosen family is a wonderful principle, but sometimes it's not quite enough. It doesn't quite fill that feeling that we have. I have grandparents who I'm not close with who are Jehovah's Witnesses, and don't accept me as a trans man and a gender fluid person. And so I am about to start my master's research project next year in planning, and a part of it has been about ontology and epistemology, and how we help people recover from trauma and cultural trauma. So I've been thinking about how you could implement and follow principles that are being pioneered by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander therapists and educators, and then apply the minority groups that are among British, you know, settlers and the descendants here in Australia. I started learning my mother's ancestors' language, which is Scots Gaelic, to build a new relationship with her after we had a number of years of trauma. And I think making it a whole cultural experience and being able to reconcile with the concept of your ancestors, whether or not your most immediate family is there to support you, would be really beneficial for people's mental health.
Thanks, Oliver. Michelle?
Oh, yeah, I just want to say, like, we did a recent, you know, snapshot of our clients, and 95% of our clients reported family violence as being, you know, the contributors to why they've become homeless. And totally agree with everything Joe said around families and parents. Unfortunately, by the time we see our clients, it's too late for some of those parents around the education. So we've been focusing a bit on schools. It's not our core business, but we've been getting phone calls from schools saying we've got a trans and gender diverse child here, or a young person, and the kids here aren't really understanding it. So we've been going out and doing education around that stuff, around pronouns and all those sorts of things, to educate other young people in school, so that at least, that can stop some of the bullying and discrimination that's been going on as well. So I think parents, and we also need to look at schools.
Thanks, Michelle. James?
I think it's probably useful to think of homelessness as a symptom in almost every case, and to start to ask the questions about the underlying causes. If I jump back to the list that I showed earlier on from Private Lives 3 and Writing Themselves in 4, it's the failure of our mental health systems and the urgent need to put funding into effective and targeted mental health. It's the domestic, family and sexual violence, and the need for effective models and services and funding for it. it's having sort of just been looking at the outcome from the Disability Royal Commission. It's the failure of systems within disability care. But I think I'd like to add one layer on it, and it's a thought coming out of a comment that Joe put in the chat a little while back about contact an LGBTIQ plus community organisation, because so much of responding to LGBTIQ plus homelessness across the board would be helped by having a much stronger and more effective, better funded system of LGBTIQ plus community organisations that could be assisting and resourcing and helping with the specific issues of culturally safe care across the board in all of the other systems of support and care that LGBTIQ plus people need.
Thanks, James. So I think that's all the responses to that question. So I've got another question for people, because there's an issue that's sort of quite contested in homeless services that I want to sort of put to the group, which is about whether or not homeless services need to be created that are specific to LGBTIQ people, and particularly kind of accommodation settings, or whether or not homeless services should just do more training to be more culturally competent around these issues, or whether or not, they should just try and recruit some LGBTIQ plus workers, like, so you have a youth refuge and you just have a mix of young people in it, and just have a couple of workers who are perhaps particularly skilled at working with LGBTIQ young people, and of course, across other ages of service delivery too. So just keen to get people's views on whether or not there's a real place for specific services for LGBTIQ plus people. Joe, and then Toby.
I'll let Toby go first because you haven't spoken.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Just I'm having some internet issues. I might actually stop my video, so hopefully I won't get cut out. This is a bit more around a housing first model rather than LGBTI specific crisis. I think just in the submissions acknowledging that intersection of LGBTI experience, homelessness, often substance use, mental health, mean that those prolonged episodes of homelessness lead to a really complicated experience, and it needs a housing first response. So it's not just a property, but it is really intensive multidisciplinary support that can last what that program suggests it needs, which is around 2 years. And so, yeah, I think it's, I work at the PLC with Thorn Harbour and coordinate their housing program, and we having the drop-in centre here is this. You see how many barriers there are for a few of our clients who will go into crisis services, and due to a number of issues, discrimination often being one, they fall apart. And it's, I think everybody understands this narrative, but it just seems quite clear to me that in those circumstances, having a sort of a culturally safe housing first option is going to be the best possible outcome.
Thanks for that. And Joe?
Yeah, I think that there's, the two Royal Commissions in Victoria, the Mental Health Royal Commission and Family Violence Royal Commission, both found around LGBTIQA plus people is that we want choice in service delivery. And so we want that, and also that we need it because there isn't an LGBTI service sector that is large enough to respond to the needs of LGBTIQA plus people. We have to be a part of the homeless sector. we can't duplicate it, or I wouldn't suggest we'd work towards duplicating it. I'm not advocating for that. So, but I do think there needs to be choice, where there is opportunities, and the choice is complicated because choice is also mitigated by where you live, right? And what does that mean? Because is there going to be choice in every, major regional centre in every major city in Australia? Like, probably not, because we're going to have, this is going to be mitigated by a particular government's willingness, and it's different in Victoria than it is to other states. Pride in Place, I understand there isn't an equivalent in any other state. But I do think what people do need, and I think some of the way around it for choice is peer workers. But which I guess is your point, Kate, about recruiting workers and having LGBTI specific workers. We must remember that, however, that all people in our community do not necessarily support every part of our community. Unfortunately, tragically, a lot of people in the LGB community don't necessarily support transgender people. So, like, when you're thinking about the workers, what are the capabilities they would need to have in order to be a peer worker? What are the values? What are the experiences? But most importantly, like, that's one thing, but most importantly, how are you going to support them? How are you going to support them to not feel isolated and alone in the work as a peer worker, and that they don't feel like they're carrying all the responsibilities? Like, I know at the moment, for example, a lot of our trans and gender diverse staff feel extremely impacted by what's been happening with the rise in transphobia across Australia. And so we need to, at Switchboard, we run specific events for our trans and gender diverse staff in order to support them. And so you'd need to be a service where, if you had peer workers that could respond to the hate, that responds to the political climate, that responds to, you must have gender affirmation leave, for starters, like in your service. And I know that's complicated with the funding model, but, if you're going to attract these workers, what is your, are you ready for these workers, and how are you going to support them in every part of sort of the needs that they might have? How are you going to support their learning developments? One example could be that they're co-located with an LGBTI service. That's happened in other programs. So they are based in your homeless service, but they are also based in an LGBTI service. That's one, and so they have that. And my final comment about this is why do we need specific LGBTI services? We have heard from LGBTIQA plus people experiencing homelessness that they are being bullied in homeless services. That is a reality. They are telling us that they are being bullied, and people are choosing far unsafer options. For example, using Grindr, using Tinder as a way to have a place to sleep that night over other options, because the place that's being offered to them, the refuge or the boarding house or the shelter, the homeless shelter, is actually not safe for them. So we know those stories, so we've got to respond to them.
Thanks, Joe. And yeah, can I just affirm what Joe's saying? And I'll drop a link in a bit to some research that was done in Victoria with LGBTIQ plus people accessing services, and there were incidences, particularly in accommodation settings, of bullying from clients to other clients, and so people experiencing those issues. But also the homelessness service system has grown with a sort of gender binary in a lot of services. So you'll have women's refuges, and then you have crisis accommodation that's men only. And so then there's also at times been issues with workers misgendering or putting pressuring people to go into a service that doesn't match their gender identity, or then, for example, a trans man going into a service for all men. If that does happen, then not feeling safe, or indeed not being necessarily safe in that service. So there's a lot of challenges for the sector to manage those client-on-client issues, but of course the sector also has to take responsibility, particularly for the worker, discrimination that comes from workers. And so I think James has dropped in the chat the LGBTIQ plus homelessness practice principles, which was a project that grew out of that research that I'm talking about, which sort of sets out best practice for homelessness services. And certainly something that Homelessness Australia promote. Oliver, over to you.
Thank you. I was just going to say, circling back round to the Housing First protocol, the Launceston City Council has committed to a Housing First and a Functional Zero protocol with their response to homelessness. I recently read in a book about the way in which, even when there is a placement settling system that essentially is a salt and pepper, it puts you dispersed just wherever the nearest or most next available house is. But this study recorded how Aboriginal people were rejecting housing offers so that they could go back to the bottom of the list, so that they could then get a house near relatives and near community. And so I think that it is a reality in that people do feel safer sometimes when you are using up more people of your own community or self-identified family. And so when I'm thinking about what I'd like to do as a planner, the kind of housing being built and how you could possibly allocate or allow an AI kind of generated spatial application so that people can, if they wish to, or absolutely not, congregate near more people that they would like to. That's what I'm trying to say. So if that's a example.
Thanks, Oliver. And look, in terms of Housing First is a particular homelessness sort of model, which is about people getting quickly housed into long-term housing, but specifically into having choice around that housing. And so, and then having intensive support to help them stay settled in that housing and connect to not just health services that they might need, but also community connections. So it's intended for people with more complex needs who've been homeless, particularly over a long period of time. But one of the things I didn't mention, but that the research that I did mention shows is that the complexity of need amongst LGBTIQ plus people coming into homelessness as a consequence of that trauma, but then also as a consequence of the risks that they face when homeless. So like Joe was saying, the accommodation settings are often not safe, and that leads people to use Grindr or other ways of finding somewhere to be, and that then they're at risk in those situations. So people often come into homelessness and then also experience assaults, sexual assaults or other kinds of assaults whilst homeless. And so then the kind of level of complexity around mental health issues, around substance use, around trauma that services are responding to is really high. And that's where a Housing First program could be really important. Kay, did you want to step in?
Thanks, Kate. I just wanted to add to that and resonate with what Toby and Joe have said. But to your point specifically about, the harm that potentially may be further endured in some of those unsafe facilities. as a partner in the Pride in Place service in Victoria, I think, you know, all of us have done a great deal of learning about, you know, that journey forward, and I can see some of my colleagues in the room nodding. But one of the things that we've learned is or what we've been able to shift, I guess, as a result of those learnings is how we practice a great, you know, in one of our services in Ballarat. So it's a very old guest house which has an enormous number of physical limitations, but implementing some, you know, physical barriers through a significant renovation, creating a vulnerable floor, if you like, a whole series of protocols around intake and so on. These things are not rocket science or I think new to anybody, but it is a model that we have echoed from Vincent Care, who have been through a number of rainbow tick cycles now in their service at Oz House in North Melbourne. And it's been quite successful. Interestingly, to your point, Joe, not everybody wants to be located on a vulnerable floor. And that's perfectly okay. But for those highly vulnerable clients, particularly trans and gender diverse folk, particularly those who are starting families and might be pregnant, there's an opportunity to really shepherd and support that experience so that we don't cause any further harm. Thanks, Kate.
Oh, I'm just talking to myself because I was on mute. Sorry. Thanks, Kay. I didn't get to finish typing, but I've just put the Homelessness Australia guide to making a submission to the National Housing and Homelessness Plan in the chat. We're pretty much at time, so I'm going to wrap us up. But thank you, Buzz. Sorry, did you want to just quickly have one last question or comment?
Oh, I just wanted to say, you know, we're not just our traumas, you know, we're people. And, you know, like segregation, putting people together, you know, God, how many times has that been done in society, you know, and lumping people in one big bunch, you know, like you're a problem. So I just find that concept of having a floor of people is a bit off for me. But you know, I understand that services are trying to address issues. I just wanted to make a comment that I'm trying to get an elder LGBTIQ social housing project off the ground. It's really super difficult to get support from organisations, and I've approached a number in Victoria. I'm trying to get a rural and remote or regional social housing project of 15 houses together for LGBTI elders with a community space and market gardens and stuff off the ground because there's all this funding out there and there's just no, you know, projects happening. But when you try and raise your hand and say, hey, I want to get something going, there's just nobody backs you up. And it's so frustrating. And I've approached my local council about it, and they put out a flyer saying, we're interested in housing development, housing projects, housing investments, you know, contact us. I contacted them and said, hey, I've got this idea. I want to get a social housing project together, blah, 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 explained, you know, what I was aiming for. And they just got negative and just said, oh, we can't do that. It won't match the zoning laws. We wouldn't approve it. And I was just like, well, gee, I just got my house. I've been housing myself after homelessness. I've just spent 5 years building my house in rural farming zone land and achieve my occupancy certificate. So you can build your own house as an elder. as an older LGBTI person, despite all the homophobia and bullshit you get sort of in the community, you can house yourselves with support, with funding, adequate funding and stuff, you know, and, you know, come on, let's get some projects off the ground. Let's actually get something actually happening, not just fucking talking about it. Sorry, that's all I've got to say. Goodbye. Everyone.
Thanks, Buzz. And I think Oliver's reached out to try and connect with you around that project.
Yes,
so thanks everyone for what's been a really appreciated everyone's fantastic contributions. It's been a really great discussion. Many thanks to LGBTIQ+ Health Australia for partnering with us in this event, and for Switchboard and Family Access Network and Michelle and Joe for being involved and helping to promote and speaking, and all the great conversations beforehand that led to the event. And encourage everyone again to make a submission. We'll send out all of the slides, links to research, and the guide to help you write a submission, and the links to how you make a submission, all of that stuff after the event, with a link to the recording. So thanks again, everyone, and onwards and upwards. We'll end homelessness for LGBTIQ+ people. If we write a submission, maybe it won't be that easy, but we'll make a good contribution. Thanks, everyone.